Welcome everybody to this wonderful Wednesday in March. This is the webinar on the Australian business culture, doing business with Australia, bridging the cultural gap with Australia. My name is Christian Höferle. I am the founder and owner of the Culture Mastery. And with me today is my much smarter co-conspirator and friend, I dare say, Brett Parry from
Chicago. Isn't it obvious? It's obvious I'm from Chicago. Can't you hear it in my twang? And are we going to battle for self-deprecation today, sir?
Yeah, well, I'll let you win that battle. So, but we already had a question come up where from Australia you are from. So let's hear it. Bring it on, Brett.
Absolutely, yes. I am Sydney born, born in the shadows of the Blue Mountains on the air. Yes, Sydney it is. Sydney it is. Good guess. I am from Sydney, and I will dig a little bit closer to the actual place I was born in just a few moments for sure. Yeah.
Well, then let's get it going. What do we need to know
Absolutely.
about bridging the cultural gap? Why is there such a big gap? Or is there a big gap? Aren't there bridges in Australia? How do we get over that gap?
There are, and you can see one of the most famous bridges in the world, which kind of covers also one of the most famous buildings in the world, if you know anything about Australia and had any exposure to it, this Sydney Opera House there you see in the back right-hand side. This picture taken from the north side of the harbour, of course, looking back towards the city, underneath the wonderful harbour bridge, which was finished in the 1930s. A marvel of engineering and a proud statue of accomplishment in our city, in my city, of course. I will call it my city because I was born there. It's such a wonderful place. So welcome everybody for joining us. Very, very happy and honored to be joining my good friend Christian here. We co-conspirate in a lot of different things, and this is one of them, bringing you information on bridging cultural gaps. And as Christian just said, in this case, there may be a perception that there's not a lot of cultural gaps from at least the English-speaking part of the world, but maybe for more other parts of the world there is. But we'll cover that as we go through. Of course, it is my country. I'm very proud of it. And this is a famous poem, a stanza from a famous poem by Dorothy McKellar, who says, "I love a sunburnt country, a land of sweeping plains, of ragged mountain ranges, of droughts and flooding rains. I love her far horizons. I love her jewel sea, her beauty and her terror, the wide brown land for me." This is a wonderful poem, and I recommend anyone to read it. And even if you're not from Australia, you can read this poem and kind of apply it to your own country. So of course, I'm Australian born. I'm very proud of my country. I'm very proud of where I'm from. And I think one of the things at the moment I just want to affirm, right, as we sit here today, there is a lot of terror going on back in Australia with the inundation of a lot of flood waters that are going on, and people are having to be displaced from their homes. It is a land where nature really doesn't have any respect for man. and so it really is, it is a wonderful place, but it's also a very dangerous place if you don't know what you're doing. Of course, when we go to another country and we do and engage with people in another culture, you have to beware of unfamiliar behaviors, and Australians have some quirks and some unfamiliar behaviors that people might recognize from the outside. We're going to cover a little bit of the origins and the influences of what makes that tick here today in this short webinar. Of course, you see three animals up there. One might say one of these doesn't fit. Of course, if you look at the kangaroo on the right-hand side and the wombat in the middle, and then somebody might say, what the hell is a camel doing there? Well, the camel has actually played an integral part in developing the more remote areas of the country. And I would argue that the country wouldn't be as connected as it is today without the wonderful influence of the Afghan cameleers who bought this animal and of course, using the adaptability of this animal and its ability to survive in very harsh climates. Now we have a lot of camels in there, and it's a wonderful part of our culture. So it's not something, again, when you come to a foreign culture, what you presume and assume may not be the fact. So today, what are we going to do? We're going to define the impacts of culture itself. We're just going to do a little quick dive into that, understand why it has an impact on your success, how and when to use that knowledge, add skills to speak to the Australian culture, explain what shaped it, as I said before, and then how to leverage not only the differences, but the similarities that you see when you're engaging with Aussies. And you're going to build on your curiosity to learn and go forward with, you know, some of that motivation that we all share when we get exposed to doing global business, is to become the most effective global professional you can be. So that's important when it comes to doing business. So we've actually done a little practice in the chat. And so we want to just, anybody who hasn't been able to find the chat, put who's, I'm going to have you answer who's in. Are you, do you want to actually learn this? And we'll go forward in that. I'd be disappointed if somebody said, no, you know what? I don't really care.
Right.
That's fine.
Well, you still have a choice. You don't have to endure
You still
this.
have a choice.
So if you're up for this, use the chat box now.
Yeah.
Just like we told you, type in "I'm in," so we know you're ready for a down under experience right now. Authentically brought to you from the Aussie man, the wizard of all things Oz himself. And by the way, Wizard of all things Oz, there's a question that is not so Oz maybe, but somebody asked about the deep dish pizza that is, do they have that in Sydney too?
Not on your life. Now, I live in Chicago and I love this town. This is a wonderful town, but that is basically a casserole with cheese in it and meat. And I'm sorry, but that is not a pizza. And I would be doing a disservice to the wonderful Italian immigrants of Australia if I even suggested that is anything close to a pizza. But that's another issue. We'll get into that. We can.
All right, we're glad we settled that. We also have somebody who.
Absolutely.
Somebody said she's lived in New Zealand for 10 years. So, well, let's see the Aussie and Kiwi differences as well. Excellent. Yes. You're all in. Love it. Let's get going.
Let's go.
Oh, you're warning us? Ooh.
Yes. Okay. So, bit of a serious touch point here. Whenever you are presenting anything on Australia, about Australia, of course, I don't know my audience. There's a bunch of people. I do this many times. I present to people around the world, but of course, I never know where there may be somebody of Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander heritage in the room. So of course, whenever I present anything on Australia, I do say this warning that it may contain the names and the images of Australian and Torres Strait Islanders. Why is that? Is because it is part of the Indigenous culture there that in the historical part of it, it's just the name. If the name was spoken, it was thought to disturb the soul of the dead, right? And so out of respect also, and these were small communities, duplications of names were very rare. So they could actually make up names and not have them be repeated. And so once a person passed away, their name was basically put into history and not spoken about again. They certainly remembered their dead, they honored their dead, but they honored the stories that they brought to them. But this is always an important thing, and I always do this, just to be safe anyway, so that if anybody wants to leave, and at that point, then we're quite happy to have them do so. So of course, this is the kind of picture I love about Australia. I think this tells everything about the land itself. Somebody who is not from this particular culture of the Indigenous people, I always respect the culture. When I was asked where I'm from, yes, I'm from Sydney, but specifically I was born in the land of the Duduk people in the northwestern suburbs of Sydney, which sits in the shadow of the Blue Mountains. So all parts of Australia are traditionally owned by the Aboriginal people. And this is actually one of the oldest, so it is been proven the oldest continuing civilization on the face of the planet. So this was the journal Science, showing that Aboriginal Australians are descendants of an early human dispersal into Eastern Asia. And this is going back between 62 and 75,000 years. This is a and that's what we call a continuing civilization. They are direct descendants from them. So a lot of history, a lot of storied history, perhaps not if it's not written and picturized history. But then again, I will talk about some of the aspects, some of the assumptions we see about Australia. If you see images of what are called Aboriginal art or Aboriginal artifacts or instruments, understand that it is a very, very wide, varied country. And there are 1,000 different Aboriginal languages in Australia. There are many, many different communities. And some people, some of those communities don't even play didgeridoos. And the art, what we call art, is usually specifically used for storytelling and passing on information about a particular place, its heritage, its Dreamtime heritage as well. And so this is not particularly art for the Aboriginal people. This is a communicative device in which they pass on stories to the descendants down through these many, many millennia that they have existed. So I think that this is important. Also, I want to set this up is that anytime I'm presenting about Australia, it is about the importance of the traditional owners of the land. Yeah. So of course, we could draw on a couple of different resources that I draw on. This is 2 books that I own in my collection. One is called Away Game, and this is specifically talking to some of the captains of industry and leaders, global leaders that have come out of Australia, and how they have actually managed to succeed on the global stage. Now, this book, of course, it is more directed towards the US market because it covers a lot of those professionals that have been successful in this country, but also outside of the US, many, many global professionals have been very successful on that stage. And then the one on the right, The Fair Go for All, this book was written some 30 years ago by a wonderful mentor of ours, George Renwick. It's a fair go for all. And if there's any indication about the differences and the similarities of Australia, I will tell you there are 3 chapters to this book. It's pretty simple. It's a pretty easy read. You have the first chapter, introductions and thank yous. That's about 2 pages. The second chapter is on similarities. That's 6 pages. And the rest of the pages, the other 72 pages, are actually on the differences. So that surprises a lot of people. And George did a wonderful job of just kind of pointing to the American and Australian differences. But of course, these differences are seen and observed all around the world. So of course, we say that when we do culture, if you don't get culture, culture will get you. This is why we do our work. Christian and I do our work, and some of the wonderful people on this webinar do our work as well. We get to the importance of why culture has an impact on our business lives and our social lives. And of course, if we just specifically drill down to, say, expat assignments, the cost of actually doing some of the mitigation of potential problems that come up by not understanding culture is actually quite minute compared to the rest of the costs of sending an expat and their family overseas. So this is just one example. Now, you don't have to leave your country to engage in another culture. You can also do it from your land, but if you're doing business with the people in that country, and in this case, if you're doing business with Australians, we want to give you a little bit of insight into that. So we call this the secret sauce. This is cultural competence. This is what really can take you up another level when it comes to engaging with foreign cultures, cultures that are not perhaps familiar to you. So how does it impact people? It impacts in very, very relevant ways. How you contact people, how we introduce, how you build trust, credibility, just change management, doing things differently, having to impart a new way of doing things in another country, conflict, managing conflict. All these kind of things are impacted by culture. They're not particularly, culture is not the only reason things might go awry, but it can often be pointed to a good starting point of the conversation. And knowing about these behaviors, behavioral preferences will benefit your work performance, and especially in a diverse team, if you find yourself not only just doing, say, business with Australia, but maybe doing business in other regions around the world simultaneously. And of course, we always, I often say to people, am I the most qualified person to talk about Australia? Now, you might be surprised by my answer. No, it's not naturally a given that just because I'm Australian, I'm the best person to talk about Australian culture. Now, of course, I have the advantage is that I do culture for a living and I spend a lot of work at my craft. So, but a lot of that work has been finding out about my culture. because we have this saying that culture hides more than what it reveals, and strangely enough, what it hides most effectively from its own participants. Edward T. Hall quoted that. And that means that, just because you're from a culture, you may be blind to the influences that make you act, think, speak as you do. And of course, I probably was as guilty of that, being in Australia, as anybody. And so as soon as you kind of come to that, as I mentioned before, Christian, we can battle for self-deprecation, but that's really all about humility. It's about saying, I don't know everything, not only about the culture I'm working with, but also my own culture. And so to understand that gives us a great basis to then think about how we might respond either positively or negatively to the differences that we see outside. So of course, we've got this two-level, this quick touch point of saying the stuff that's on the surface, all the wonderful things that we see through our five senses, the consciously observed, the dress, the accents, the way of life, the approach, all that kind of thing is above the surface. What we get into is the stuff that's under the surface. And for a country like Australia, this is where it trips people up, especially if you come from an English-speaking country. The Aussie culture is very similar to a lot of other cultures, English-speaking cultures on the world, because we get our influence from that. But underneath that, historically, and what motivates people in Australia is quite different. So we can talk to some of that. So this is what we call this implicitly learned unconscious. It is very hard to change. Australians have not changed much over this period of time. And of course, it can be very subjective. So we use some tools to establish this. For those of you who are not familiar, Globe Smart Profile is just one of these tools in our cadre, where we start the conversation through observing the potential differences across a couple of different dimensions. In this case, we've got 5 of them. There are other tools that use a wider scope, at least at the start, but this is a good one to start in, and you can actually go to globesmart.com and you can do your own profile for free, gives you kind of access to that. And then outside of that, we can actually observe and look at some of the research-based knowledge that has gone into making up the profiles of the countries we're dealing with here at any one time. So of course, if you know anything about the world, you might look at this. You might have been brought up in school to observe the world in this way. This is just a map. We might see it on the walls of businesses around the world. Of course, when it comes to us Aussies, we prefer to look at it this way. Who said it's down under? Nobody said that we're at the bottom of the world, and therefore, why can't we be at the top? And this map is a very cleverly drawn map, of course, with a bit of tongue in cheek, but it's all about perspective, right? So why can't Australia be in the middle and at the top? Now, of course, all countries, you could draw any map like this, but in terms of the Australian psyche, sometimes us Aussies can be a little bit ego-driven and say, we tend to punch above our weight a little bit, so why can't we be the center of the world, right? So that's a little bit of a joke. Now, what I want to do is just stop for just a quick second. If anybody's got any perceptions about your exposure, your interactions, perhaps maybe no interactions at all, if you can put in the chat, what are some of the things that come to mind when you think about Australia or the Australian people? And I will premise that by saying that as I've traveled the world, and I've had the good fortune of traveling a lot of this world, I bump into a lot of people that say, I used to know an Australian that lived down the street, or I interacted with them on the bus on a tour in the middle of Africa or something like that. And there are certain perceptions that people come to. So if you want to just kind of have your put your observations in there. We've got sporty, Lucy's got sporty in there, absolutely.
Open, sporty. Warm,
sporty.
Fun, relaxed.
Chill.
Here it is.
Chill. Good. There's a panel coming up that'll talk about that. Absolutely. Chill.
Right.
So
and Anthony says he's quoting a 6-year-old book that apparently is titled "They're a Weird Mob."
They're a weird mob. Yes.
How much of that is actually true? He's asking. Well, we'll get into that.
We're quite weird.
Use of humor. Cool turtles from Finding Nemo. There we go.
Yeah.
Our
It's
friends from
42 Wallaby Lane. Now, listen, see, the fact that I can quote that address is pretty pretty bizarre.
that's
Um,
drastic.
Absolutely. So I'm going to just keep typing them in. I'm going to move on because we want to get through the content here. So the history
Right.
of Australia, and when I talk about the Australian culture and any culture in the world, I've found, as I've learned about any culture, you can discover a lot by its history. Now, fortunately for Australia, when it comes to the European colonization of Australia, that's not a long history. So when it comes to the current business environment, we've got kind of a pretty accessible resource to be able to look for, right? Now, of course, we're not talking about the Aboriginal culture. Aboriginal culture, there was no written language, so therefore all that culture was handed down verbally and through dance and music and things like this. But the colonization part of it, which obviously forms part of most of the psyche of today's Australian business environment, is only about 250 years old. So a lot of this history is pretty accessible. But of course, as I said, that colonization by its very nature infuses a lot of immigrants into a country. So just like the US, where I am, we are a nation of immigrants, and a wide diversity of immigrants, especially. The English language is predominantly used, of course, so that makes it kind of accessible for at least English speaking, and a lot of people in the world where English is either a pretty close second, especially when it comes to doing business. Christianity, not a Christian country, but Christianity is the majority of the faith practiced in Australia, and a lot of the holidays and the structure of what you observe when people take time off and things like that, you're going to be find is usually on the Christian calendar. So Easter and Christmas and things like that are usually the times when you're doing business with Australia, understanding that that's a big part of it as well. But that doesn't mean, because we're a nation of immigrants, we have a lot of wonderful people that practice Islam, Buddhism, Jewish community there. So it's always important to recognize and affirm that as well. So when it comes to assertion, we do assert our freedom. We like our freedom in Australia. We enjoy it. Very, very blessed. And it's one of the things I always say, that the ultimate privilege is to be born in a place like Australia, where you are born into absolute freedom when you're born. And I will never kind of underestimate the impact that that's allowed me in this world, in contrast to a lot of people in this world that have not had that opportunity. So we have gone from an agrarian society in terms of building our wealth on farmland and exports and things like that, to the industrialization structure, where we've actually developed a lot of industry, manufacturing and things like that, which has found itself seated in a lot of the major centres in Australia, like Sydney, Melbourne and Brisbane and Perth and so on. So we have urban centred populations. Of course, my hometown of Sydney, with 5.5 million people, I say, is a very, very large city by world standards, in terms of its feel. Now, I'm talking about the feel. If you go to Sydney, Sydney feels like a big urban setting, as big as anything I've seen here in Chicago. I've been to Shanghai. It's not actually an unfamiliar feeling for me. It is a big city. It's a global city. Now, Melbourne is kind of the same. As you get to the smaller regional cities, they're smaller and a little bit kind of more, let's call them country town, but still very vibrant urban centers that bring a lot of value to the country. And we have kind of free movement and migration, although that doesn't mean it's easy, right? We have free movement in and out of the country. Anybody can come. Of course, now we're in a pandemic, so it's a little difficult. It's even difficult for me to get home, even if I wanted to go home and help some of my family and that are struggling with the floods. But it is an open society where we have encouraged the free movement between people from the world. We have the values of independence. We talk about, in terms of the dimensions I mentioned before, if you look at the dimension, the average dimension of the Australian, we actually do tend towards being independent. But there is a difference between that independence, for example, just to give you an example, between the US and here. where the Australian independence is more of a groupthink independence, saying we are proudly independent as a group from the rest of the world. And in the US here, that independence is more an individual independence, individual from everybody else. I don't have to rely on everybody else, and so on and so forth, which is one of those very, very small nuances that can trip you up extremely badly if you're not prepared for that when you go to Australia, or just as Australians come here to the US as well. So we are a democracy, of course. We have free voting. We have a voting structure that needs to take place every 4 or so years. But it's a slightly different system to here in the US and a lot of other places in the world. But we draw our influence from the Westminster system in the UK. We're informal. So we use, as somebody mentioned here, a sense of humor. We're happy to use humor. We're happy to use your first name when we first meet you. You're a mate. And this gets to this kind of sense of group independence. You're a mate starting out. We take you as the whole person. So if you're doing business with Australians, understand, you come with a pretty high pedestal already. We're going to treat you like a mate, and we're going to expect you to reciprocate that as well. But we'll be competitive. Anybody who's looked at the Olympics and any of the sporting accomplishments of Australians will see that we are a very competitive community, but we're also competitive in business. We actually will kind of bring our sense of we're here to make an impact. We probably punch above our weight pretty well in the rest of the world, supported by a great deal of infrastructure, by organisations that are built by the government to support Australian businesses going to foreign lands. I think of organisations such as the Australian Trade Commission. There's AmCham for here in the US. There's many, many different organisations, because these companies do a lot of great work in the rest of the world. And we are pioneering by that very nature. So we've grown up in a very, very inhospitable place. So pioneering, getting resourceful, having to kind of fix things quickly on the fly has been one of our core values. And then, of course, we do espouse our freedom as well. So just as a bit of a contrast, if you think about the US, the continental US, and its landmass size, anybody who's been to the US knows the size of this country. The landmass of Australia is the same size, give or take a few thousand, maybe square kilometers than the continental US. But you will also be surprised that maybe after when you've got 322 million people filling up the US, it's a lot less than the 26 million people in Australia. So therefore, we, again, getting back to that urban-centered kind of tendency. So anything in the chat I need to respond to, do you think, sir?
Well, Christina is asking, she knows it's a bit out of context, but there's a prime minister that disappeared in the 60s and was never found. Is that true?
Yes.
Is that an unresolved mystery?
Yep, unresolved mystery. He's still swimming somewhere around, yes. Yes, unfortunately, he did go swimming and didn't come back. Yeah, that is one of those things. We also lost a prime minister by being fired by the Queen. He got sacked, he got booted. And his whole government was booted by, that's Australia. That was in 1975. But yeah, so that is true. So when I say colonisation existed and started in 1788, the landing of the first fleet, after many, many kind of forays by explorers from all kinds of different countries. But ostensibly the UK claimed ownership of Australia, for want of a better word, and sent 11 ships that arrived at January 26th in 1788 to establish what now was the original colony in Sydney and Botany Bay. And of course, those who do know a little bit about the history, that was really basically a shipment of convicts, of criminals. So that is a joke. The English guy that turns up at the airport now in Australia comes up and puts his passport over the counter, and the Aussie guy says, "Oh, well, g'day, mate. How are you?" He said, "Just a few questions. Have you got a criminal record?" And the English guy says, "I thought I didn't have to have one now." That is just kind of one little joke that we use. But obviously people do say you come from a land of convicts. So that is just one joke that's thrown around, but it is true. Now, when it comes to the Australian psyche, think about this as kind of what we term as a larrikin sense of humor. Somebody brought that up before. This is a very cheerful, outgoing larrikin in the sense of it's a little bit mischievous, right? There's a bit of mischief in the eye, behind the eye of the Australian professional. So that sense of humor comes out quite a bit. Resourcefulness, I mentioned before, very, very important that you understand Australians can be very resourceful when you're doing business with them. Spirit of mateship, a core part of this society is that we are mates first, as I mentioned before. And you come in as a mate. I introduce myself to people, even if I don't know them. G'day, mate, how are you? Nice to meet you. Now, of course, you then have to live up to that, and that's the important part when you're dealing with Australians. So courage, Anzac spirit. I'm not going to get into the historical aspects of Anzac. Anzac stands for Australian New Zealand Army Corps. But if you Google Anzac and the history and the impact and the profound, I guess the profound insights that come from the Australian spirit because of this, Australians will kind of, even if they've got no link to the army or anything like that, they will use this kind of sense of courage and identify that when it comes to putting themselves out in the world. Notion of a fair go, right? A fair shake, a fair crack, as we might say in Australia. Everybody can have a crack at it. And if you're worth your salt, then, you know, we're going to give you the space to do that. So, and we also kind of have a bit of a distrust of authority. That obviously does come out of some of that historical aspect of, I guess, you know, a self-consciousness of being derived from a convict lot, that now we've got something to prove that we are worth our salt, and but we're not going to have our government tell us that, right? Now, obviously, where there's been kind of small rebellions in the history of Australia, but ostensibly we do kind of respect our government. But of course, if you look at where the prime minister, the leader of the country, has to go to work, it's far different than what you see here in the US, for example, where it's a separate branch of government. The government and the prime minister in Australia has to pull their pants on and go to work every day and answer the people. They have to get their hands dirty, and it's important.
I want to jump in on this real quick.
Yep.
Because I want to remind everybody in the chat. I just asked the question: what's one thing that you learned so far that may have come as a bit of a surprise to you? I want to know, how does this resonate with you? What's something that is new to you, or that you put into a new context around what you already knew about Australia? So I'm curious to find out from you, what is that one thing? Type it in the chat box now, please.
Yeah.
And I have a question around mateship. You said, as you approach somebody with a good eye, how are you, mate, that there is an expectation that this newly minted mite that you called out to be one has to live up to that expectation. Is that something of an extended courtesy, or even I approach you with a lot of matey credit because I want you to reciprocate, and we don't go into a phase of distrust to begin with. We extend trust, and we fulfill that. Is that the expectation?
Yes, it is basically an assumption that I'm coming to you as a fully formed human being with my intention to trust you, and therefore I'm hoping that you will trust me as well. Now, that doesn't go completely right for Aussies in some parts of the world. We tend to, you know, one of the things I joke about, it's very difficult to sell the concept of intercultural learning even to my people, because the idea of, you know, we just think we're bloody hilarious. And of course, who wouldn't love an Aussie, right? Where, you know, I'm literally in a country where every time I open my mouth, it gives me a certain amount of privilege, because I have an accent which is kind of, I guess, in most cases, beloved by a lot of people here. So there is that sense that I live and breathe that privilege every day, not only from my external, you know, the way I look, but also my accent. But it is important to remember that Aussies can be come off a little bit conceited and brash in that sense. You know, you can be confronted by this person that just assumes that they're kind of like, we're already mates, right? And therefore, you know, you're expected to reciprocate. If you come from a country and a culture where that's not natural to you, then pretty soon you can see where a disconnect would happen. The Australian then would think, yeah, gee, that bloke's a little unfriendly. You know, what's up with him? You know, or she's a bit crusty. I can't believe it. You know, why can't we just have a great chat? And so that's an important point. Yeah.
And that could be the foundation of lots of misunderstandings, as you guys will find out in, well, we've got something planned for you, so stay tuned till the end. We're not going to go into the deep rabbit holes here, but there's a place for those rabbit holes. So
yeah,
go ahead, Brett.
No, I think it's a good point. CS here is the reverse concept of down under versus top of the world. So this is the trick. You know, it's a kind of a superpower of Australians can do this. They can be self-deprecating in terms of, you know what, we don't care. We're down the bottom of the world. Don't worry about us. We're fine. We're just going to do what we do. And yet, when you come to in a competition with an Australian, and they are maybe trying to compete with larger, more experienced organizations, so on and so forth, that's when that kind of they flip the switch a little bit and say, hang on, you know, you don't know where we are. We're actually important, right? We're a big country. We are a continent all on our own. We're the largest island in the world. There's this sense that sometimes, in a very kind of self-deprecating way, they can flip the switch on people when they're not ready for it. And that sense of, you know, we're not talking about the physical place of Australia. We're talking about the conceptual place of the Australian importance on the global stage. But that's a good observation. So it does surprise a lot of people when they first come across a lot of Aussies. So, of course, as I mentioned before, agrarian to urbanization and industrialization, the saying is that Australia was built on the back of the sheep. It was one of our first big exports, followed very closely by cattle and wheat. You know, we've got a lot of land, a lot of flat land. You know, these animals don't like to climb hills, and wheat grows much better on a flat piece of land. It's easy to harvest. And then, of course, as mining became, following the gold rush of the late 1800s, mining became kind of prevalent. And then we discovered that we are actually one of the largest holdings of a lot of different natural resources that the world loves and wants to buy off us. So this impacts our place in the global stage quite largely. Two of the biggest mining companies, Rio Tinto and BHP Billiton, are actually the two largest mining companies in the world. They're Australian companies, and they have operations all around the globe. So you will find them all around the place. The other thing is surprising for most people, even though that I've just looked at all those kind of products as an export. The largest export for Australia is not even a product. The largest export is foreign students. And when I say not Australians going out, I'm talking about the money and resources that foreign students bring to Australia, right? In 2019, 26.7% of the student body in Australia were foreign born. And they came there specifically to study in Australia. So, and Australia outstrips the rest of the world by a huge margin. The data is 1,600 people to every 100,000 people of population in Australia is a foreign student, right? And it's a huge amount. The second is basically the UK with 650, and then below there is France and Germany with about 500, and then the US so somewhere below that at about 400. So we are a huge draw for foreign students. Now, what do? A lot of them come there, they learn their craft, business skills and acumen in Australia. Some of them stay and have wonderful contribution to the business environment in Australia. But they also, remember, they come from this, if you're engaging with an Australian young professional that maybe from your perception who was born outside of the country, they are as smart as anybody on the planet, and they have learnt their best acumen and business skills at the foot of some of the best teachers in the world. Some of these students also then leave Australia after this, and they go and deploy themselves in the world. So just because you are dealing with somebody in a country that perhaps maybe of your culture or another culture that you might know a little bit better, if they kind of indicate that they went to school in Australia, understanding the influence and the style of education, the way business is taught in Australia, can be even important in that aspect, because there are a lot of very, very highly accomplished business professionals in the world that, that kind of sharpen their axe in the Australian, very, very successful Australian foreign student program. So just keep that in mind as you're going around the world. Perception is not reality. Okay, so I want to check on time. I'm just going to go through this a little quick. I just want to touch on, I want to touch on the aspect of sport. Sport, cricket. If you're not from a country that loves cricket, then you probably do not have a clue on what I'm talking about here. This is a this is a wonderful sport. It's my sport, but I use sport as a metaphor a lot for Australian business. Australian business is very much like a cricket match. You can get a rule book, right? Wisden's rules of cricket. It actually exists. But I would argue if you have not played this sport from a young kid, right, you do not understand this game. So this is just very true when it comes to dealing with culture in general, but also very nuanced when it comes to Australia. Because we could sit down and give you the hows and whats and what not to do and all that kind of stuff, but understand that Australians have grown up in this Australian environment of their business. And so if you don't have access to the nuances of the game, so the cricket is a game and it's long form each game goes for 5 days. And each day is about 6 or 7 hours of play. And then at the end of those 5 days, only about half the time do you actually have a winner. Now, this can be discombobulating for anybody who actually comes from a culture where there must be a result. There are clear-cut rules and strategies and linear processes by which you go through things, but that is not necessarily true for Australians. So just keep that in mind as you're going through that, right? We dig a lot deeper into that when we do our larger trainings and things like that. So people think about Australia as a nation that plays a lot of rugby, the kind of oval ball type of sports, but also football in the traditional sense of soccer. That's also very popular in Australia as well. Of course, we look at this, we think about this kind of celebratory accomplishments of Australian businesses and how they might project themselves in the world. Now, when the Americans went to the moon, what did they do? They put a flag in the ground. It was live on TV. I'm being facetious here, but it was a big event. I mean, the globe was watching it, right? And of course, we put the flag in the ground and we say, we are the best. Of course, if we'd have done it, we would have taken a little bit more time. We would have cracked the beer open and gone, geez, that's a bloody good view. Now, why would I want to share this with anybody? So this is kind of some of this kind of downplayed, less celebration of kind of success in an outward form that Australians will bring to the table, which can be misinterpreted as maybe a lack of confidence, maybe a lack of kind of the ability to be very forward and bold and confident in their ideas. So when it comes to communication, of course, we use this quote all the time, that the biggest problem with communication is the actual illusion that it's taken place. Now, this can be applied to any culture. When it comes to Australia, this is specifically even more nuanced. Nah, yeah, means yes. Yeah, nah, means no. And of course, yeah, nah, for sure. Absolutely, it's going to happen. So now there's
say those again. Nah, yeah.
Nah,
yes.
yeah, nah.
Yeah, nah. So when it goes down,
absolutely.
it's no. When it goes up, all right. Okay.
Yeah, right. There's it's kind of
for sure.
There is an intonation, yeah. So this is the trick with Australians, is to get to the core, and there are three distinct, and we dig into the three distinct accents that you find in Australia as well. We're not going to get in today because they're quite fun to dig into, but we do that in the larger sessions. But then think about, there's a comedian that says when he went to Australia, he always kind of got the impression that Australians always describe things by what they weren't. So how you going, mate? Yeah, not bad. Yeah, and well, or yeah, not good. So is it good? Is it bad? Is it kind of medium? I don't know. You know, it's so when say somebody is appraising your work, and you bring it to them and you're quite proud, and the Aussie goes, yeah, that's not bad, not bad. You know, that actually could mean that's the best thing I've seen since sliced bread. Right. So the downplaying perhaps of the most Australians, when they come to say the US, are quite interested in why there is such a everything is awesome type of attitude here. She'll be right. Absolutely. She'll be right. You know, so if you're right. So there's an example. She'll be right. If you go, you know, I've got this, I'm not sure it's finished, I'm not sure it's going to work. And a lot of Aussies will say, you know what, she'll be right, mate. Don't worry. We'll get to it. We'll fix it later, you know, especially if it's like 5 o'clock in the afternoon. Thank you, Helena. Good to see you. We'll be sending out the link to the replay. Thank you for joining. Yes. Very, very grateful. Thank you. And, you know, when it comes to saving face, you know, a lot of cultures in this world are driven by saving face, are driven by the outward expression, how we turn up in the world, the way that we kind of think about things, and whether we're embarrassed or not. Of course, in Australia, this doesn't exist. We actually don't mind making a bit of a deal of ourselves. And so we're quite happy to do that. We will laugh at ourselves. Australians will laugh at themselves first before laughing at you. But don't worry, we'll get to laughing at you. It's not far behind, but we'll laugh at ourselves first. This can be a little bit confusing for a lot of people that say, you know, like if you get two Australians talking to each other and they're observed by a bunch of people from not from Australia, there is the tendency to think these guys hate each other, because there's a lot of this kind of friendly banter that involves, quite frankly, a lot of abuse. So this can be kind of misconstrued as conflict, whereas to us, it's basically bonding and seeing how much we can kind of stretch those. So sarcastic, of course, never will I be sarcastic. Never. another point about Australian culture. If you're confronted with a very sarcastic Australian, we will deploy this like a superpower, and it can come off for very literal cultures, people who take things very literal by the word. This can come off as quite discomforting. Absolutely. You know, I left this in. We've been talking about this. Christian and I host a daily show on culture. We're talking about this week. Actually, when are we going live today? 12 or something like that, right? Yeah, 12 my time.
We'll dive deep into that in our broader courses, where we actually make the very valid point that culture and personality are not mutually intelligible. So we want to make sure that you know about how culture affects human behavior, but also how personality affects it, and how those two factors are intertwined and play together. And in order to get a deeper understanding of culture, you want to be masterful in both aspects, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. This is just one tool we use. As I said, the Globe Smart tool is another. These, you know, we don't know everything, believe it or not. I mean, well, Christian does. I don't. I'm just, you know. No, but no, it's we use these tools as starting points with our clients. And as I've gone through here today, I've kind of done a very, very kind of high level touch points on particular things that you might observe about Australian culture. But of course, it's much deeper than that. And as I said, it's much nuanced. And especially if you come from an English-speaking country where you doing business with Australians, you know, may have a lot of importance for you, whether you engage with them or whether you actually go to Australia and do business personally. So right. It can have a big impact in not understanding some of the very, very underlying nuances of Australian culture, but to know them gives you such a wonderful step up. We're welcoming people on the surface. We are, absolutely. And I'm very proud of my country for that. But we do have our, you know, particular nuances, and they're worth pointing out and looking at for sure. Yeah. Okay.
Well, You heard it from the source directly. So I want to say, is this man good or what? Is he the Wizard of all things Oz or what?
No, I don't know.
Thanks, Mike.
He made that up, by the way. He made it, the Wizard of all things Oz. But I kind of like it. I kind of like it.
Yeah. If the shoe fits, Mike, wear it. So obviously, what Brett said, we're scraping the surface here because time constraints, and we know we're already keeping you longer than we had planned. And thank you to all of you who are staying on. We actually want to take you much deeper on this. We want to take you much deeper on this path of really understanding Australian culture and how it impacts you in your dealings, whether it is directly on the continent or whether it is with Australians you interface with in wherever in the world you are, or whether it is done remotely as it is for many of us.
Now
we're going to have a 3-hour business training, mainly focused on business. We'll talk about some fun stuff too, because, well, let's face it, business can be fun if done right, and it will be done right if you understand Aussie culture better. So we're going to have a 3-hour training where we really dive deeper into some of these rabbit holes that are relevant to you and that we think are relevant to anyone doing business with Down Under. It will be live sessions, live online. This is not going to be recorded. This is interactive. Brett, a little bit of me, but mostly Brett and you interacting in 2 90-minute sessions. And those sessions are on April 14, as you see here on that slide, April 14 and 16. I posted a link in the chat box. It is clickable. Click it now, find out about it. Tell me if you're in. Let us know, are you in with us Down Under in a in-depth training? You know how to do it, how to type I'm in. We'd love to welcome you on the, what is that magic pipe that sucks us down under, the Elon Musk invented Hyperloop. That's what I'm looking for. Join us in the Hyperloop to Australia. Let us know you're in. Type it in the chat box so we know we can count on you. There'll be a follow-up to this webinar with a recording, and again, the links that you need to take action on this. April 14 and 16, we're going to be here for you to actually get some stuff done that will help you be successful when dealing with Australians. Wizard of all things Oz, anything I missed?
That's it. Just reach out to us. You can see all our socials on here. Maybe join us today at 12. We're going 12 Central Time, 1 Eastern, right? Is that right? Live on Facebook, live on LinkedIn, live on YouTube, our daily show called Two Chaps, Many Cultures. If you want to be a guest, come on and be a guest. We need to learn. Yeah. We need to learn more. But that's just another part of our activities. But here, you've got our contact details. Call us, email us, snail mail. I don't know. I'll give you my address. Send me a Christmas card. I don't mind. That's fine too. But I don't know. Thank you so much. I'm so honored. I'm so grateful. Thank you for the attention. We've kept you longer than we meant to do it, but I can get carried away, and Aussies will tend to do that. We will keep you for longer, especially if it was in the afternoon. I'll have a beer here. That would be kind of perfect.
I'm sure he's got a beer that he's not showing you, but that's all right.
all right. Thank you, sir. Very much appreciate it.
Thank you, everybody, for being fully engaged and sharing your learnings with us and commenting and questions and everything. If there are more questions, you know where to find us. Respond to the email follow-up that you see from us. And we look forward to engaging deeper with you and looking forward to many of you joining us on our journey to deeper understanding of other cultures. And well, good night to you, mites. And that's the extent of my lame attempt at sounding Aussie, which
no worries at all. Happen. You do quite well.
Thanks, everybody.
Yeah, listen, mate, you're not bad. You're not bad. You're not good, but you're not bad.
All right. Thanks. Bye, everybody.
See you. Bye.